Welcome to Chapter 6. We're going to talk about indexes, scales, and typologies. So indexes and scales are kind of similar. So what they have in common is they're both measured at an ordinal level. So it goes in an order, but the distance between the different options is not equidistant. And they're both composite measures. So they're both taking several measures and combining them together in order to create a measure of some variable. Now the way they differ is an index is a type of composite measure that summarizes and rank orders several specific observations. And then a scale is several things that have a logical or empirical structure among them. This will make a little more sense as you see some. So indexes. A composite index is a more valid measure than a single question. A lot of times we're measuring some variable with just one question. So for instance, a lot of research will measure fear of crime by asking the question, is there anywhere in your neighborhood where you're afraid to walk alone at night? That's just one measure. That's obviously not capturing everything that has to do with fear of crime. So an index, a composite of several measures, would be a much better way of measuring something more abstract, right? And it allows us to create more variation. So we're looking at a few things when we're constructing an index. So first of all, everything that we include in the index should on its face, like at face value, appear to measure your construct, okay? So whatever variable you're trying to measure, if you were going to measure fear of crime, each piece you put in there should at face value look like it's related to fear of crime. A composite measure should represent only one dimension of that concept. They should all tap the same dimension. And when selecting items for an index, we should also be concerned with how much variance they provide. So we can select several items that generate responses that divide people about equally on the variable, or we can select items that differ in how they vary. So let's take an example. How religious is someone, okay? So face validity, this could include things like, do you go to church? Do you attend religious services? Do you accept the following beliefs? How frequently do you pray, right? Those are all things that on their face seem like they're related to how religious someone is. We want to make sure then items reflecting political conservatism should not be included in a measure of religiosity, even if they're related, right? So we know that these are two variables that are related, but that's not a variable. How conservative you are politically does not measure your religiosity. Now we could be very general or very specific or both in how we're measuring this. So general ways of measuring it would be like, do you attend religious services? Do you accept these beliefs? How often do you pray? They could be more specific too. Do you go to confession? Did you have a bat mitzvah? Do you bow towards Mecca, right? We could ask very specific questions. We can select several items that generate responses that divide people about equally on the variable. So no single response would justify characterizing someone as religious, but someone who responded as religious on all items might be characterized as religious. And then we could also, choose things that clearly identify you as religious or not. So when we're looking at this, right, we want to have these so that we can look at empirical relationships. Are there statistical relationships between, scientific relationships between our variables? Because that's what we're trying to study, right? So we could look at bivariate relationships. This is just a relationship between two variables. So to come back to that example there of religiosity, you could look to see, is there a relationship between how conservative someone is politically and how religious they are? Multivariate relationship is a relationship between more than two variables. So the variate in both of these means variable, and bi means two, and multi means multiple. So they sound fancy, but they're not. After we determine what items we're going to include in our index, right, we have to figure out how we're going to score them and what value we're going to assign to them. So we would have a range of measurement there. Maybe you're asking people like, how often do you attend church? And that ranges from 0 to 1 to 2, like to 7 days a week, right? And we have to make sure we have an adequate number of cases at each point in that index. We also need to determine whether to give each item equal weight. Are you going to just sum your items together and treat each of those measures of religiosity as equally important in determining someone's religiosity? Or does some things sort of count more? Should they be weighted differently? So we might ask someone about their job satisfaction, right? We might ask questions like, wow, guys, this should not be job satisfaction, right? I feel downhearted and blue. I get tired for no reason. I find myself restless and can't keep still. I am more irritable than usual. That doesn't sound like it's measuring job satisfaction. That sounds like it's measuring irritability, frustration, unhappiness, right? So you could code these as like, on a scale of 1 to 5, right? Like, I never feel this way. I rarely feel this way. I sometimes feel this way. I often feel this way, right? And we call these Likert scales usually. They often range from like strongly agree to strongly disagree. You guys have all seen these in a survey before. Now, sometimes we're constructing something and we've got 5 or 6 variables we're going to put together. We're going to make a composite measure from them. And for some of our respondents, we're missing data, okay? And that's going to happen. People don't always answer every single question. Sometimes you can't understand what they put for a response. There's different ways to deal with missing data, and this isn't something I want you guys to worry about too much. This is really more of a statistics issue, and it's really more advanced than what we do in statistics. How I've dealt with missing data in the past is I just don't include it. But there's ways there's methods you can use to decide to like, you could treat it as one of the responses that was available. So you could find like, what's the average response, and you put that in for anything that's missing. You could look for patterns. There's all kinds of statistical things you can do there. Just know it's an option. You don't have to know how to do it. Now we've put an index together. Now we need to know if it's valid. Does it really measure what we think it's measuring? Okay. So we can do this a couple ways. One is through looking at the items that are in it. We can assess whether each item included makes an independent contribution, or is it duplicating stuff that like another item in there. So say you've got like 5 things making up your measure. Do each of those things contribute something unique to your index, or are 2 of them tapping into the same thing? In which case you might not need both of them. We can also test it externally, right? We can examine its relationship to things that should predict that variable and see if that's actually happening. So sometimes our index doesn't predict the way we think it would, right? We're like pretty positive one thing is going to predict the other, and it doesn't. What's happening here? Well, it could be there's no actual relationship there. It could be that our index is just not good. We're not really measuring or properly tapping into the variable in question. So here's a couple examples of some index measures. So there's the Human Development Index. These are both things that the United Nations uses to measure the status of women in different countries. This compares women and men in terms of life expectancy, education, and income. When you look at these, the countries that are doing the best in this regard are Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Not really surprising. There's also the Gender Inequality Index. This is measured by proportion of parliamentary seats held by women, proportion of administration, managerial, professional positions held by women, access to jobs and wages. Here are leaders, Denmark leading in both, Slovenia, Switzerland, Germany, and Austria as well. Okay, so these are just multiple. These are both indices, whatever, that measure the status of women across the globe. Okay, we can measure a different way. You guys might look at this and be like, "No, there's other variables we should put in there, other ways we could measure this." Okay, now let's look at scales. So an index might fail to take into account something that not all indicators of a variable are equally important or strong, right? So let's go back to this, right? Maybe we feel like life expectancy isn't as important in predicting human development or equality for women as education or income is, and so you might want to weight them differently. So scales allow you to sort of include intensity a little bit more. Okay, and there's a couple different types of scales. Again, I just want you to kind of know about these. You've probably seen these in different ways. You just don't know that that's what they are. So the one you're going to be most familiar with is the last one on this list, a Likert scale, sorry. So there's a Bogardus social distance scale, and this is a way of determining the willingness of people to participate in social relations of varying degrees of closeness with other kinds of people. Thurston scales are composite measures constructed in accord with weights assigned by judges. So you've asked other people to, other experts to look at something and judge and determine like how that should be weighed. What's more important? Not really used in research today because it's kind of costly, time consuming. You got to get a bunch of experts to agree to do this for you. You guys are most familiar with a Likert scale. It's usually a scale of 5 or a scale of 7. Any of those ones that go from like strongly agree to strongly disagree, that's a Likert scale. And then there's a semantic differential. This is a questionnaire format in which you're asked to rate something in terms of 2 opposite adjectives. I'm going to show you one of these that we used in some death penalty research that Dr. Terry Markovic and I did. It's a scale that's been used a bunch of times, and it's got like opposite adjectives that describe the death penalty, and you sort of rank where you feel on that, okay? So like enjoyable versus unenjoyable, like the closer your check mark is to enjoyable, the more you think it's enjoyable. Closer it is to unenjoyable, the more you think it's unenjoyable. A Gutman scale is a composite measure used to summarize several discrete observations and represent more general variables. Here's an example of one for like support for abortion. And then we have typologies. You guys might be familiar with typologies because you've probably seen some of these somewhere. So if you've taken serial killers with me, you know we've looked at typologies of serial killers. There's typologies of sex offenders. God, I'm giving you guys like all the scary typologies. There's, you know, typologies of all kinds of stuff. So this is basically taking and classifying observations in terms of the attributes on 2 or more variables. It's a nominal composite measure. It's often used in social research. That's our field, social sciences. They can be used effectively as independent variables, but they're generally not good as dependent variables, right? So we can use them to try to predict some dependent variable. So for instance, you might have a typology of delinquent and criminal acts, okay? And maybe you break this down into like none, right? I've engaged in no delinquent or criminal acts. I've engaged in minor ones, vandalism, theft of things worth less than $5, moderate, theft over $5, gang fighting, carrying weapons, serious, car theft, breaking and entering, sexual assault, selling drugs, okay? And maybe you use these to classify people into non-delinquents, starter, like, hey, I'm just starting out in delinquency, a desister, someone who's like, what do you call it? Aging out, stopping offending. Someone who's a stable offender, de-escalator, escalator.